Just a short break here while we're waiting for that casting to cool, and I like to talk about resources. I've got really only 2 books on Foundry, but this is one. I had it back when I was in college. But it's called Fundamentals in the Production and Design of Castings, but there is a nice section in there on match plates, but not cast match plates like I've been doing here. And another good book, this is a Navy book from NavPers, Molder, and this is a pretty good book. I think they had one called Casting too. This is an original Navy issue here, but Lindsay had reprints of this, but of course Lindsay went out of business. But I always have to laugh. Actually, it's not a laugh, but it saddens me when I look at this, and this came from a library someplace, and not only was it never checked out, but they couldn't even spell it right. They called it Boulder 1 and C. Maybe that's the way it was in the old card catalog and nobody could find it. I have seen that many, many times. I like to go to libraries, and you'll find that some of these books have never been checked out ever, or possibly one time. That saddens me. Flash, update. I just found another book I forgot that I had, and while I was putting the other books away, I ran into this in my little technical library. It's called Pattern Design, and again, it was a school book, but it must have been my dad's, because here in his handwriting is the formula for core sand. I recognize his handwriting even though he's been dead for almost 50 years. But in this book there is a nice section on match plates, including cast match plates. Maybe that's where I learned about this besides my brother. I didn't forget about these, but I'm sidetracked here, still waiting for them to cool. Jay Nelson out of Pennsylvania was a good guy that watches my videos, and he sent me these brass castings. And these were made by PM Research, I believe it is, and he sent me the drawings also. Now the reason I'm showing you this is that these were probably made on a little match plate. And this is brass or bronze, and what these are tiny little valves like this. And I got the blueprints for them, and they are meant to be used on model steam engines, and I think they sold these in 3 different scales. This is the 1/4 inch inlet. I may do one of those this winter because I have the blueprint. And these other ones here, still on the tree, are tiny little brass elbows like this. So there's an elbow there, you know, one in each corner, and then we got some 45s that right here. This would be waste stock here. In the center, a cross, T's, and this one right here would be a coupling. A coupling. So thank you, Jay. Pretty awesome. Here they are. Now the reason I got all this fall in here on the gating system, and I could care less because that's all scrap, but I just rough sawed that on the bandsaw, and it wasn't smooth enough to withdraw. I didn't want to take the time on that. I was getting too anxious. Got a little bit of a cleanup to do around the edges here. In a big foundry, these cast iron ones probably were shot blast or tumbled. So most of the cleanup was probably done that way. So as you can see, this pretty much filled up that 10 by 12 flask, but I think I was a total fantasy man there, thinking that I could put 6 or 8 in one flask. Would have required quite a large flask to do that. I could have probably nested them a little better than that, but I just don't have a flask that large, and you're getting the point of how I did that and why I did it with 2, as well as if there were 100 on there. But in a big foundry, they would maximize production by putting as many as they possibly could and nesting them, probably, like I told you, if gating isn't too much of a problem. Now before I talk about shrinkage, let's review what I did here. I started with the $2 cast iron fry pan that I got at the flea market. From that, I made these 3 so that I could use them as patterns. Actually, I only used the 2 as a pattern, but they're numbered 1, 2, 3. And from these then, I made the match plate, which was the production tool, or tooling. And from the match plate came number 5 and 6. And the finish on these has degraded a little bit as I went along from one step to the other. And by the way, I had to pour this fairly hot because this is really a thin cross section. I think I'll saw 1 1/2 so you see how really thin it is. And if you pour the metal too hot, sometimes you don't get as good of a finish. However, if you pour it too cold, like 1200 or 50 or 1300 degrees, it doesn't run through because it isn't all that fluid. You know what is really a fluid metal is cast iron. Wow, can it go into tiny details and narrow and cross sections, small cross sections. So that's what we did. So now, shrinkage. Now for the subject of shrinkage, and I'm not talking about the kind of shrinkage that George Costanza talked about on that old episode of Seinfeld, and some of you will get a chuckle out of that if you know what I'm talking about. But I'm talking about shrink rate for molten metal when it solidifies. And iron has a shrink rate of about 1/8 of an inch per foot. Aluminum, in one source that I had, said 5/32 per foot, and the other said 3/16. So I'm going to use 5/32 simply because I have the right rulers to illustrate what I'm talking about here. But we also have to talk about double shrinkage. So when the pattern maker makes patterns, he uses shrink rules. Here's a shrink rule that is 1/16 per foot. Now this is a standard stair at 12-inch ruler, but if you stack these alongside of that ruler, that's the standard ruler. Look at how different lengths they are. And these ends are flush. So those are shrink rules used by pattern makers. And magnesium and lead and all of them have a different shrink rate, so the correct ruler must be used. Now let me show you what I mean by shrinkage on these castings here, because we have the original, the pattern that I made, and then, well, we made another pattern, but I'm not going to measure that. I'm not going to measure the match plate, but I am going to measure this, yeah, number 5, with my caliper, and you're going to see how we got big, medium, and small. Now when I measure this one, the original, right across here, I don't really care about that number there other than I want to compare it. Now when you look at this one, look at how much smaller that is. And the final generation, look at how much smaller that is. Now if we went on down the line here and did 20 of these, each one would be smaller, and eventually they would be small enough to include as the prize in a Cracker Jack box, or for my granddaughter to use in her little dollhouse. It would just be a tiny little thing. Each one gets a little bit smaller. That's why we have to allow for shrinkage. So if the pattern maker was going to make this match plate, he would start probably with a wooden one. He would work with wood to make the very original, and instead of using a 5/32 per foot, which is this one, he's going to have to allow for double shrinkage, so he would use the 5/16 per foot. And these two rulers, you can see here, are not the same length. So this would be wood originally, and done with the 5/16 ruler. And then this would be the second generation. That would have, that way it would not have shrunk because he was making this oversize. Well, it would have shrunk, but the shrinkage wouldn't matter. And then this is the third generation where the double shrinkage would have ruined it if it wasn't allowed for. Now, it doesn't matter in a little novelty project like this, but if it was some critical project, you'd end up with a casting that was too small if you did not allow for shrinkage. I hope that I explained that and didn't double talk too much, but that's what we're talking about with shrinkage and shrink rules. And that's why pattern makers get paid so much. They're like tool and die makers, because everything that they do is complicated and it has to be thought through very, very much. I saw the number 3 casting through just so you can see how really thin the cross section is. So when you pour this, or when I poured it, temperature was pretty critical. Now, I do not own a pyrometer, so everything that I do there with my furnace is baguesse and bagosh, and this just happened to turn out all right. But over the years of teaching and so on, the number of castings that were that failed because of thin cross sections was probably numbered in the thousands, because remember, the kids were doing this too, and even what seemed simple to us for a 15-year-old boy produces a lot of failure. Yeah, it's not an ashtray, it's just a glorified chiclet holder. This casting weighed 6 pounds. This is probably one of the longest videos I ever made, but I hope you enjoyed this and understood what I was doing, why I was doing it, and how I ended up with this cast match plate pattern. Let me know if you enjoyed this. This video will have to be split up into probably 3 parts. Thank you for watching, and please continue to watch my videos.